Three Religious Rebels, Part 3, Stephen, Chapter 2. This chapter is entitled, Stephen Furnishes Heaven with a Problem. Peter put on his black habit the next morning. He felt better. As he stood with one foot in the stirrup, ready to vault into the saddle, he turned to Stephen. "I'm glad it rained, Stephen. I'm glad I got soaked. This visit has been a blessing in more ways than one. I understand Citeaux a bit." As he swung up into the saddle, his horse pranced a little. Peter reined him in, looked down on the abbot, and laughed. "But I'm glad I'm heading for home." "You don't like Citeaux?" asked Stephen. "I didn't say that," replied Peter as his horse sidestepped a pace. "But I do say that I love Cluny. My parting shot, Stephen, is this. You've justified everything about the place, even that denuded church. You're still a rationalist. But don't be irrational enough to ban the Duke." Stephen laughed, raised his hand in blessing, and said, "I hope the clouds burst soon again. You're old enough now to know that you should come in out of the rain. Give the Grand Abbot my sincerest sentiments of esteem and my warmest affection. Tell him we are not condemning Cluny, for just as in my Father's house there are many mansions, so on earth there must be many monasteries. Then beg him not to be too shocked when I ban the Duke." "You're going to do it?" "I'm going to do it," answered Stephen with a resolute nod of the head. "For good or ill, you're a man who knows his own mind," Peter answered with a smile. As he looked down on the abbot, he continued, "Our pilgrimage to the eternal city was made together, Stephen. Our pilgrimage to the city of eternity is being made." "Together in spirit," broke in Stephen. "It's the same God we worship. It's the same home for which we are heading. Peter, I'm very grateful to God for allowing you to spend the night with us. Pray for me when I ban the Duke. Then spend the night that follows with me in spirit, for I'm quite sure it will be very black. But simplicity, poverty, and solitude must shine at Citeaux like stars in the midnight heaven." "You're stubborn, Stephen," chuckled Peter, "but I'll be with you." Then as he put spurs to his horse, he traced the sign of the cross over the head of the abbot of Citeaux. Before the week was out, Stephen had talked to the Duke. The Duke listened as sympathetically as he could. He tried hard to understand the abbot. His only fear was that he or his men had given some offense. Reassured on this point again and again, he gave fuller mind to what Stephen had to say. When told of the high aim of the contemplative, intimate union with God, he understood Stephen's zeal for solitude. Before the conference ended, it was made clear to Hugh that he would be welcome always as a visitor, that the rule provided explicitly for guests. But what the rule did not provide for was the noise and bustle of a large gathering and the distraction inseparable from the colorful retinue of a duke. Hugh admitted the principle and accepted its application. He warned Stephen, however, of two things. First, that he was inviting sharp criticism even from those who had heretofore been sympathetic, and second, that he would alienate the nobility. He went further and pointed out that Citeaux had retained just as much land as she could cultivate herself. She had refused all other sources of revenues. She had cut herself off from what all others considered legitimate sources of income. She insisted on being self-supporting. What now if there should come a rainy day? Just as a person needs friends, so does a monastery, he warned. The abbot replied that he had weighed all that, but he was ready to hazard everything so long as the Duke was not offended. He even admitted that it was not prudent policy to attack long-standing custom as he was attacking it, but he insisted that principle would allow of no other course. Hugh bowed before the abbot's decision. Before the next feast, he told his intimates that they could no longer celebrate the solemnities at the abbey. When he gave the reason, angry fires of indignation were kindled, which soon burned away all friendship for the little monastery in the swampland. Peter had predicted what Stephen would bring, a swarm of hornets buzzing around his head. But Peter proved a false prophet. There was much buzzing, and it was done by nobles and monks who were as mad as hornets, but they did not buzz about Citeaux. No, that little monastery was left severely alone. The nobles shunned it as resolutely as a burnt child shuns the fire. But this isolation did not immediately produce anything save joy for those in the swampland. When the Duke had so royally accepted the situation, Stephen felt that the rebellion was at last complete. Mitigations were gone, all compromise had been cut away. Citeaux was supporting herself by the labor of her hands. Simplicity shone in her office, her mass, and in her entire monastery. Poverty reigned supreme, and solitude was at last assured. If ever a man had perfect surroundings in which to live with and to God alone, that man, thought Stephen, was the monk of Citeaux. The place now, with the world locked out and the monk locked in, was a veritable paradise of prayer, while the nature of the terrain, with its woods and swamps and soggy undergrowth, made it a real purgatory for penance. A monk had to labor if he would live. Before July had burned herself into August, however, Stephen was frowning. His monks may have been free from distraction. He had provided for that by banning the Duke, but he himself was far from free, and day by day he grew more and more distracted. For July was really burning into August, and even clammy, swampy, ever-wet Citeaux was dry. Vegetables do not grow in dust. The abbot began to fear for his harvest. By the end of September, his worst fears were realized. There was no harvest. Soon it was evident that even the sparse diet prescribed by St. Benedict could not be provided for the little band lost in the woods. So before the leaves had fallen and November had grown gray, Stephen, who had locked out the world, had to go out into that world and beg. From castle to castle he went, and while he was received with reverence, he was not welcomed with warmth. Nobility had been outraged by his act. Most gave him something, but they very persuasively pointed out that the summer's drought had been universal. Stephen accepted the little with gratitude and went away as he had come, with a smile. There was much derisive laughter over the abbot and his smile. Nobles and monks who had long predicted Citeaux's demise were having their hour of triumph. It was only a matter of time now until their prophecy would be exactly fulfilled. The 12th century was the 12th and not the 6th. In it, St. Benedict's rule had to be interpreted, not read literally. Citeaux would soon be a swamp again. So they talked. But exult as they would, they could never free themselves from an element of puzzlement and doubt that was produced by that unfailing smile on the thin and worn face of the abbot. But a greater puzzle existed for those simple souls who had watched the growth of the abbey and marveled at the zeal of her monks. Here were men who had done all that it was humanly possible for a person to do in order to glorify God in the most generous way. Here were men who had risen above the mediocrity of the world around them and the sluggishness that lies deep in every human soul. Here were men who had battled their way up to the very heights of heroic Christian living, men who had brought chivalry and gallantry within cloister walls, men who had flung themselves down before God, a holocaust, and their immediate reward was affliction. These sincere, simple souls were more than puzzled by Stephen's smile. They were shocked by it. How dare a man smile in the face of such trouble? But they never knew the secret source of that tranquility, for they never knew the abbot's deep devotion to the Mother of God. From her he had learned her whole story, how, After answering the angel's salutation with a whole-souled, generous fiat, she immediately became the mother of sorrows. That had been a life lesson for Stephen. He used to go over and over the facts he had learned at his lady's knee. How when her child was ready to be brought forth, she was hurried from her home to a town of crowded inns and closed doors. How she had scarcely given birth to the world's Savior when she was driven across desert sands and forced to dwell among the swarming gods by the teeming Nile. How she lost him at the age of 12. At 30 he left her, and at 33 she held him, blood-clotted and cold, outside the temple-crowned city and the home of his chosen people. It was at Mary's knee that Stephen had learned how to say fiat, how to suffer and how to smile. But there was another lesson he had also learned from Mary. He had watched her at a wedding feast and saw how she presented facts to her son and demanded the miraculous. Stephen would be like her in this also. He would present heaven with a problem. If water could be changed to wine just to save a young couple from embarrassment, surely 3 sous could be changed to something worthwhile for a starving community. So just before the snows of winter, when he heard that there was to be a fair at Vézelay, he called an obedient monk to his side and said, "I have scoured the house. This is all the ready cash I could find." The monk held out his hand. Into it, Stephen placed 3 little sous. When the monk looked up, Stephen said, "Go into Vézelay. There is a fair there. Buy 3 wagons. For each wagon buy 3 horses. Then load those wagons with clothes, food, and all the things we need. Come back to us then in prosperity and joy." The monk gazed down at his hand. The 3 sous looked unbelievably small. Then he looked up at his abbot. Stephen was smiling. The monk did not answer that smile. He looked down at his hand again. Then Stephen laughed aloud, took the monk by the arm, walked him to the gate, and with the tiniest shove said, "Go, God will provide." The monk went. Naturally, he was puzzled, very puzzled. As he walked along, the suspicion grew that perhaps hunger had addled his abbot's brain. But he kept on his way, for obedience becomes instinctive with a thorough rebellious. But often along the road he took out those 3 little sous, stared at them, shook his head, looked to the skies and sighed. "Lord, you'll have to provide a lot. 3 wagons, 9 horses, all the clothes and food we need, and all for 3 sous. Oh." When he arrived at Vézelay, he put his hand into his pocket to be sure that the 3 little sous were there. He found them. They seemed to reassure him. Then he did the natural thing. He sought out a friend to tell the whole sad story and to get his sympathy. He found the house, entered, took out the 3 sous and said, "Look at what I've got to get all that Citeaux needs." Then, with a meaningful nod of the head toward the little sous in the outstretched palm of his hand, he told his friend the whole story. Just as he finished, his friend slapped his thigh, rose with a sudden spring, grasped the forlorn monk by the arm, and excitedly cried, "Come. I know the man who must see your sous and hear your story. Come." Out of the house they went, the friend dragging the monk along behind him, down the street, across a wide lawn, and into a great mansion. Here, with very little ceremony, the friend hurried the monk to the bedside of a very sick man. The story was briefly told. The sick man heard it, raised himself on his elbow, and in a weak, cracked voice called to his wife, "Give this monk every sou he needs. Citeaux shall have her wagons, horses, and all she needs." Then as he sank back on the pillow, he gasped, "Tell them to pray for me." Next day, Stephen and the community were out in procession to meet the man who had still the 3 sous, but who was leading back 3 wagons, each with its 3 horses and each piled high with the things the Citeaux needed. As he handed the sous to the abbot, he smiled and said, "God provided, but I certainly was scared." Stephen only smiled. He saw that Mary had not forgotten how to get favors from her son. But those 3 wagon loads only took the community through the winter. As March winds began to blow, sickness struck. Plague was stalking the land in the wake of famine. Citeaux was not passed by. Then for the first time in 30-odd years, Stephen's smile vanished. Hunger and real want never shook his confidence, but death did. Into those usually clear eyes, clouding uneasiness came, and on that usually placid brow there appeared a frown as the grim spectre, with merciless regularity, walked into the church and emptied stall after stall. Recruits had never been plentiful. Not all who came had stayed. After the banning of the Duke, they stopped coming altogether. In church, Stephen had to look at the ever-shortening line of the choir and listen to the ever-thinning volume of song. He grew deeply troubled. Week after week, he had to kneel at newer graves. The crosses kept thickening in the graveyard, and the troubled abbot began to suspect that soon Citeaux would be but a haunted house with a crowded cemetery. Were the critics right? Had he and Alberic and Robert gone too far, demanded too much? Was he entirely mistaken in the newly born belief that they had been raised up to shock the complacency of the monastic world of the day? Had 6 centuries so changed men that Benedict's rule could not be observed? Was God himself displeased with the presumption of Citeaux? If not, what meant these 13 years of comparative barrenness and this devastating mortality now? The furrows deepened and the clouds of doubt grew thicker. He remembered what Robert had said about the evening star, his evening star, so solitary and alone. Others come out after it, he had said, but before they do, we will have to see the dark. "Oh God," cried Stephen, "it is dark now, pitch dark." And even while he cried, there came to the hollow, chilling sound of that loud wooden tablet that told of death striking again. "Oh dear God," groaned Stephen, "it's growing darker. It's time to do the daring, it's time to do the desperate thing." With that resolution firmly fixed, Stephen went to the deathbed. Then, in a silence that was nerve-shattering, he gave a command that struck fear in the heart of the boldest. "Brother Felix," he said, "by virtue of your obedience, I command you to return to us after your death with information concerning our state of life, telling whether it be pleasing to God or no." The monk died. A few days passed and nothing happened. Then Stephen began to grow frightened. Had he been too daring? Had he been presumptuous in thus presenting heaven with his problem? But what could he do? It had grown so dark. He had to do it. His horizons had all gone black. He had to send someone to the source of all light. Then one day, when all were working in the fields, and Stephen was at their head, he gave the signal for their usual short rest in the middle of the work period. Walking to one side where he could be alone, he suddenly found himself in a blaze of light. Startled, he lifted his head and looked directly into the eyes of Felix, the brother he had commanded to come back from the dead. Stephen gasped and fell on his knees, but Felix only smiled and said, "Lay aside all doubt, Reverend Father, and hold for certain that your manner of life is holy and very, very pleasing to God. Furthermore, your grief at your want of children will soon disappear, for many will come to you, men of noble birth and learning. Yes, and like bees swarming in haste and overflowing the hive, they shall fly away and spread themselves throughout many lands." Stephen smiled his old radiant smile. Furrows faded from his brow, and clouds disappeared from his eyes. He looked like the young, eager Stephen who had listened to Alberic talking about Crusader's sons with the Crusader spirit. He looked even younger. He looked like the mere boy who had stared at the evening star and heard Robert's prediction about other stars coming out after dark. Then his hand came up, and striking his breast, he breathed, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Forgive me, Lord." That same evening he stood at his window and watched the sky. When the west was white, he saw the brilliant silver radiance of Vesper, all beautiful but all alone. He stood at that window and kept staring into that sky. The dark came slowly that evening. It came subtly, imperceptibly. In the more distant and deeper blue, Stephen saw tiny silver anemones break through and flower in 5-petaled loveliness. It was long years since he had watched the blooming of the sapphire skies. He felt that he was seeing it now for the first time, and he found himself softly singing, "It is the glory of God that the heavens tell." Mists rose before him, and through his tears he saw shimmering silver grandeur. Robert was right. Stars do come out after dark. Many stars, he thought. Then with lifted face he prayed, "But dear Lord, it has been so dark, so pitch dark, and I have been so alone. Robert went, Alberic died, we lost our benefactors, poverty came, then want, beggary, hunger. Suffering was followed by sickness, then death. It was pitch black, dear Lord. There were no stars, but I should not have faltered. Forgive me my weak faith. I know now that it is only after dark that stars come out." Next day, Stephen was in a far corner of the little cemetery, standing by Alberic's grave. The leaf of his life fell, he thought, and when it fell, it was flaming red. Many, very many have fallen since. The ground around me is covered. Thank God they too were scarlet when they fell, all changed, all beautiful. But the tree whence they fell became more bare, and I grew frightened. Winter had come. Alberic spoke of the Crusader spirit. They had it, these few, but most had fallen. The shields for the Sacred Heart lay battered and broken, and there were no strong arms to snatch them up. But spring is here now. The ground grows softer around his grave. The tree whence fell his scarlet leaf is shooting with tiny green tips. The woodland breeze grows warmer, and hope, the hope of younger years, comes warm again to my heart. I miss him, that old silver lance. But when I stand here, he seems close to us, and he brings me strength. I must complete his work. God has said that men will come. I have no doubt that they will be what Alberic promised and prophesied, Crusader sons with a Crusader spirit. Then he knelt and prayed from the inmost core of his being. Dear God, grant that those who do come grow as this man grew, strong, straight, and true. And when it comes time for them to fall, let them fall as he fell. Let them fall as flame. Naturally, the message Felix had given him the day in the fields filled Stephen's mind. He went over it again and again. Men of noble birth and learning, he had said. Stephen loved that first word, men. Yes, he wanted men, for only real men would stay and live the life of Citeaux. It was a rugged world, this little monastery in the swampland, and in it there was no room for the effeminate or the weak. It was a world that demanded passion, but had no time for sentimentality. It was a world that challenged the depths of man and called forth his highest vigor and bravery. That was why Stephen loved the first word of the message, for he well knew that the virile can be brought to high virtue and the strong to towering sanctity. He thanked God for the first word with its latent promise of strong, virile, vigorous men. The qualifications Felix had added set Stephen dreaming. Men of noble birth, he had said. Stephen recalled a remark he had made to Robert years before. They had been discussing Alberic and the secrecy about his lineage. Stephen had laughed at his abbot and said, "Even if Alberic is sprung from the lowliest of serfs, he is still a nobleman." Stephen did not care so much whence men came. He cared a great deal about what they were. Then he reflected that his often used illustration worked all ways. Good atmosphere and environment weather a soul and shape a character, just as an atmosphere that is tainted and an environment that is evil can soil the purest and warp the stoutest. Gradually, that first qualification made some appeal to Stephen. Noblesse oblige spurred knights to magnificent daring and immortal doings in the world. Why then could it not send souls of nobles scaling sanctity's topmost heights from within the lowly cloister? The argument seemed sound, and slowly Stephen grew fond of this first qualification. But the second held no immediate appeal. Men of learning. Of what use was learning in a world such as Citeaux, where from foundation stone to cornice the substance was simplicity? Of what use was learning to men whose one work was to praise God in the Psalms of David and to humble themselves as serfs sweating in the soil? Of what use was learning in a world where the only science was the science of the saints? Stephen frowned over the qualification. What did it mean? He himself was accounted a man of learning. He had spent all the years of his youth in school, first those of England, then those of Ireland, and finally those of France. And yet he felt he had never been to a real school until he entered the abbey at Milan, and endeavored to forget the learning he had acquired as he bent all his attention to learning how to walk in the footsteps of the Nazarene. Of what use was learning to a lowly monk? But then Stephen stopped frowning and opened his eyes in wide surprise at himself. What was coming over him? Was the weathering process taking effect on himself? Was he being conquered by environment and made subject to suggestion? Was the oft-repeated but untrue cliché that learning is no aid to sanctity working its way into his subconsciousness? He sat down at his desk to reason out the problem. It was true that God is charity, but the God-man did not so characterize himself. His words were, "I am the truth." Christ said he was the truth. That is also true of the Godhead. God is substantial truth. It must follow then, argued Stephen, that every tiny truth firmly grasped, no matter in what order, is really getting a firmer, fuller grasp on God. And that is why a monk lives. He wants to grasp God. His life is nothing but groping, a continual groping after God. Eternity will be the everlasting embrace of him he longed to hold. Everything then, from the abstract mathematical truth that 2 and 2 make 4, up to and including the subtlest, purest, and most refined of metaphysical notions contained in the concept of God's essence, must be interrelated. Hence, they are manifestations of the being we love and adore. Therefore, the sharper the intellect, the keener the ultimate sanctity. That would be a truer saying than learning is no aid to sanctity, said Stephen aloud. But true rationalist that he was, Stephen paused and asked, true in the speculative how about the practical order? But true rationalist that he was, Stephen paused and asked, true in the speculative, how about the practical order? How has my education helped me in my striving after sanctity? He had not reflected long when a wide smile lit his countenance, for he saw that it had helped and helped immensely. Further, he saw that it always would help, for the more vivid the fancy, the more lively the imagination, the keener and quicker the perception, the firmer and fuller would be the grasp on truth. Stephen was really thinking now. God is not grasped by hands, he argued. He is not folded into one's breast and hugged by arms of flesh. No, he is spirit, and can only be held by the Spirit. That is why the intellect is of such paramount importance in the spiritual life. Sanctity is a product of the head and heart, not of the heart alone. Stephen drew his chair in to his desk. This subject deserved attention. He had never realized how important the intellect was, but now he saw that the will was a blind man who was led along by the one faculty of the soul that could see. Love is the result of knowledge, he reflected. Then he thought of faith and grew enthusiastic as he defined it as an intellectual assent, not a palpitation of the heart or a surge of the feelings. It is the mind that matters, he almost cried, for it is the mind that acts as helmsman for the monk, steering him between the whirlpool and the rock, keeping him from the Scylla of mere pictistic mouthings and sentimental effusions of feelings, as well as from the charybdis of callous, cold, mechanical performance of duty. A monk must not be a stoic nor a gushing geyser. He must be a rational being. Mind must be his mentor. Indeed it must, for faith, hope, and charity depend on the faculty that knows. Stephen sat back and shook his head in hearty agreement. He saw now why some souls were abashed as they entered the religious life and began their quest for intimacy with God. Their wills were right. They longed after the divinity. They wanted to grasp him and hold him to their hearts. But their minds were wrong. They were not men of learning. They thought that some infinite abyss yawned between them and the one who made them and saved them. They had never grasped the relation of all things to the absolute. They had never known that the way to God is the wide open way of the universe, and that no matter where they stood and no matter how they turned, their first step could be a step toward God. That's the truth, mused Stephen. They were not men of learning. Hence, they did not know how to read the signposts that a provident God had set up all along the way. They had never learned that every creature, from a tiny violet nodding in the breeze to those mighty silver spears whirling through the stretches of the skies, is an index pointing directly to God. What a subtle heresy is abroad in the world of religious, exclaimed Stephen. Too many are confusing simplicity with stupidity. They are looking on science as an enemy to sanctity. They firmly believe that an intellectual person cannot be humble. Then the abbot smiled. If it weren't so tragic, it would be amusing. I wonder what they think Christ's intellect was like. They cannot deny he was humble. From that day on, the entire message of Felix pleased Stephen greatly, but it also stirred his impatience. He smiled and prayed much those days, and his greatest prayer was for patience. For after reasoning long on each phrase in the message, he had concluded that every qualification had place at Citeaux. And since he had the assurance that his manner of life was pleasing to God, his only remaining problem was how to hold himself in calmness until heaven would fulfill the promise it had made. That problem he also presented to heaven.